Thank you. Thank you for hanging in here for the last presentation of the afternoon, because I'm sure other people are feeling sleepy as I am. Hopefully, there'll be enough here to discuss that we'll all be able to stay awake until the end. So I'm going to start, because I think this is fundamental to discussing the connections between partner violence and child abuse, by talking a little bit about definitions. Whenever you're doing research on something, you have to figure out how you want to define the phenomena that you're going to be researching, so that you know what to include and what to exclude. And with both partner violence and child abuse, a whole variety of different operationalizations have been applied in the literature. So there isn't any consensus. Both, obviously, if you look at state laws, there are no two child abuse laws on the books that are the same, or partner violence, and there's no consensus in the research area either. Today, because it is what is most easily researchable, I'm going to be talking about a physical aggression-based view of partner violence and child abuse, using the conflict tactics scales that Dr. Strauss talked some about earlier this afternoon. So these are scales that ask about aggressive acts, ask about some other things too, but for the purposes of this, they ask about a range of physically aggressive acts, from milder, more low-level kinds of physically aggressive acts like pushing and grabbing, up through more severe aggressive acts, threatening with a weapon, using a weapon, scalding a child, those sorts of things. So some of those are behaviors that we would all agree are inherently abusive. You can't scald someone and have that, and obviously non-accidentally, scald someone and have that be a misunderstanding. On the other hand, some of these acts, spanking, grabbing, are things that some people in our society think are fine, other people don't. And instances like, especially with partner violence, you've heard whenever there are discussions about whether the conflict tactics scales are a good, valid measure of what we mean by partner violence, you'll always hear the discussion, well, a push isn't just a push. You can have a push that's just that, and that's nothing. And then you can have a push at the top of the stairs or over the back of a balcony. Those shouldn't be minor. Those are very, very powerful kinds of pushes. And all of that's true. And we're not capturing that in the aggression definition that I'm going to be using today. As a little aside, I've done some work over the last few years with my colleague Richard Heyman, working within the United States Air Force, and this work is now spreading throughout the Department of Defense, and trying to develop some empirically based, as best we can, clinical definitions of maltreatment that can be used in clinical assessments that use aggression plus some sort of impact and incorporate fear or injury or significant potential for injury in the act, and that those have now been through several field trials and look like we can use them reliably. So I think we're moving in the direction of being able to have more developed, kind of nuanced definitions of these phenomena. But most of the research at this point is still based on severity of the physically aggressive act. Obviously, verbal aggression is also important, and also psychological and verbal aggression occurs along a continuum from more minor incidents through things that are incredibly horrific, even in a single incident. And today, mostly, I'm going to be talking just about physical aggression. So if I'm saying we're going to talk about aggression and not necessarily just aggression that ends up resulting in significant injury, why is that important? Well, Dr. Strauss did a nice job today of talking some about the data on spanking and corporal punishment. But in fact, we know that even minor physical aggression, even a little pushing and slapping, is a very strong risk factor for more severe partner violence later on in a relationship. Minor acts of aggression can be inherently dangerous, and the data on impact are really quite complex, and I think we're just starting to kind of work our way through more complex models. But it seems likely that it's the bad stuff in families, not one particular bad class of bad things, that results in bad outcomes for the people in the family. And that includes minor as well as more severe aggression. So this is just to kind of get us all on the same page before we look at the data that I have. National surveys tend to suggest 12 to 16% of couples engage in physical partner aggression. And over 80% of families, 90% if you're looking at toddlers, report corporal punishment, and 5% of families with children report severe aggression. So those numbers are already kind of stark and I think high. But only one of the surveys there that I just reviewed on the previous page collected reports from both people in the couple. It was a spouse abuse study, and that was the one that got the 16% prevalence. There haven't been as many large-scale studies of parent-to-child aggression. I think there are a couple reasons for that. One is that I think our systems like to think that the child welfare system does detect all of the maltreatment that's out there. And so as long as we count the cases that CPS finds, we're good. There's nothing else to count. And then, of course, obviously, research on severe aggression against kids is methodologically a little bit challenging because you get into mandatory reporting, and a lot of researchers want to stay away from that. So they just rather not ask the question and not know. But because of that, there haven't been any large-scale surveys about the frequency of severe parent-to-child aggression where if you have two parental figures in the household where both people have been asked. And I think we would probably all agree that just because one parent doesn't say that they do it, we don't want to necessarily think that that means the other parent doesn't either. We also didn't do this in this study, but this is just one of the things I think is interesting. We haven't had any large-scale studies that have looked at risk of abuse to more than one randomly selected target child. So we don't really know a lot about kind of abusive families in that sense, because probably not all children in the family are at equal risk. And also, in at least some of these studies, complete anonymity isn't able to be provided, and you would think that that might affect reporting. And also, nobody's done all of this all at one time. It says to both parents, report behavior to the child and to each other, and da-da-da. So we thought it was important to try to kind of take a step back and look a little bit at the level of the family and try to see the interconnections. There's been significant evidence available in the literature for quite a while now that partner violence and severe parent-to-child violence tend to co-occur. There was a meta-analysis in the late 90s. Meta-analysis is where they're able to compile all of the studies that have been done on a particular topic and then apply statistics to the statistics to try to get a sense of what the kind of true strength of the effect is across all of the research that's been done. There was a meta-analysis done that estimated that approximately 40% of the cases where one of these phenomena were happening, the other one was also happening. And we also know that one parent's aggression tremendously increases risk for the other partner to be aggressive. So why care about co-occurrence of parent-child aggression and partner aggression, and even about male to female and female to male partner aggression? Well, I think there are obvious screening and safety planning implications. If you don't know who's doing what to whom, it's hard to manage the risk in that household and make sure that everybody who needs to be kept safe is safe. I would also argue, although we don't have enough, we're just kind of starting to approach this, that there are treatment planning implications. That I would think it just stands to reason to me that if I'm someone who has a problem with aggression with every single person I live with, that my treatment should likely be different than if I have a problem with aggression with you and no one else. And that I might have different risk factors involved, and there might be different mechanisms there. And then that leads to etiological research. There might be different mechanisms involved that we need to understand if we really want to understand the whole array of family violence. If you look at the co-occurrence literature, there's some obvious things, or at the parent-to-child aggression and the partner aggression literatures, there's some obvious things that jump out and say, okay, well, that might be why they're connected. There's a reasonable amount of discussion in the partner violence literature that types of violence could be directly related to each other. That one type of violence, the scenario that's most typically offered in the literature is the husband is aggressive to the wife, and either because of the strain of that or because she's afraid that the children will incur her husband's wrath, she is aggressive to the children. And so it kind of spills down the chain. That's a scenario that has been described a lot in the clinical literature. You can imagine other ways that they could be causally connected. The child's acting out, the parent is aggressive to the child, the other parent is upset at how the parent handled the situation, and now they get into a fight, and that fight escalates as well. So it could be that they're kind of causally connected to each other, or it could be that they co-occur because there are underlying mechanisms that are in common between the two. And that if that were the case, it would also mean that there would be underlying mechanisms that are not in common between the two and might help you understand who is at risk for both and who's at risk for only one. When you look at the risk factor literatures, which I hope no one else has spent this much time doing, there's a lot of risk factor literature out there, you find that even though almost all of the existing child abuse literature has been done on mothers, and almost all of the existing partner violence literature has been built around male perpetrators, that probably 90% of the variables that show up as risk factors in one literature show up as risk factors in the other literature. Just unbelievably strong overlap. And those kind of fall out into some different classes. The first obvious one is sociodemographic markers. These are things that people in the field generally think are not directly causal, but stand in for other kinds of stressors. Poverty is an example of one of those. They're what we've started referring to as role-independent risk factors. These are things that are not about you as a mother or you as a wife, but they are something that would simultaneously affect the way you would behave in both relationships. My stress level, my degree of social support would be things that would affect my functioning, how depressed I am, but are not specific to my partner or my child. And then there are role-related risk factors. These are things that maybe are a little different with your partner and your child, but there might still be a shared kind of underlying common thread. An example of this that's in the literature are negative attributions, blaming attributions. In both the child abuse literature and the partner violence literature, there is pretty strong support that people who think that when something bad happens, your child spills a glass of milk or your partner's late from work, that it's because the other person was just trying to bug me, that you're at much higher risk for being aggressive. You could have blaming attributions about your partner and not your child, and vice versa, but it seems likely, although no one had previously looked at it, that you might have a general attributional tendency to have hostile attributions. And then there are also a few variables, like I said, that are not in common. Things like power imbalance in marital relationships and couple relationships doesn't show up in the parent-child literature. Why? Well, because that's inherently an imbalanced relationship, right? Jealousy and sexual jealousy and that sort of stuff doesn't show up in the parent-child literature. Things like parenting style, there's not really a good corollary for that in the partner literature. So there are a few separate kinds of things. So we decided we wanted to try to do this study to kind of unpack all of this and look at it in a single sample. Our first goal was to understand rates and patterns of co-occurrence. We wanted to develop and test some more comprehensive models of partner and parent aggression with those huge risk and protective factor literatures. Part of what you don't get is which of these factors operate most proximally. How does all this stuff fit together? If there are 57 things that put me at risk, how do those things operate with each other? And therefore, where would you, if you wanted to intervene, kind of as downstream as possible at the variables that take account for the most variance, which variables would those be? Because people who study socio-demographic variables often don't study psychological variables and all sorts of things like that. Everybody picks their favorite 3 and studies those. We wanted to start to look at the importance of individual factors versus dyadic and family influences, and also get a little bit of preliminary evidence on how often it is that one act of aggression causes another act of aggression. So the data I'm going to present are on a community sample. These are not folks who are involved in child protective services or have gone through the court system. So that's important to keep in mind. This is as representative a community sample as we could get. We used random digit dialing, which is a technique that you randomly call phone numbers that you don't even necessarily know their phone numbers to find people who might be eligible. All the families that meet a demographic profile you invite to participate in the study. It lets you be able to know how representative your final sample is of all the folks who could have participated. So we had a final sample of 453 couples. They had to have been, because we wanted to look at both parenting and partner stuff, so we needed them to have both functioned as parents. So they had to have been cohabiting for at least a year. We wanted at least one partner to be the biological parent of a 3 to 7-year-old child who spent at least half the time in the house, because we wanted them to be kind of actively parenting. Biological parent was just because we didn't think there would be enough families where no one was biologically the parent of that child for us to pull those out for subgroup analyses. And we needed to be able to get everybody through the protocol in English. So we did have bilingual staff who were able to help people whose Spanish was kind of more predominant than their English, but they needed to be able to kind of get through. So on average, and you're going to read this and think, well, this is a very privileged sample. They seem just perfect. And then when we get to the next slide that shows you how much is going on in these families, then you'll wake up. So, so on average, they're in their mid to late 30s for having a 3 to 7-year-old child, right? That's not too young. I mean, we're doing work right now with unmarried couples of newborns. It's hard to find the 18-year-olds. And so these are all people who are grown up. 95% of them are married. On average, they've been to 2 years of college. Their family income was typically $75,000. Now, Long Island is a high cost of living area, but that perfectly matches the median in our county for the 2000 census, which was around when the data were connected. And the families typically had 2.4 children. So it's a very representative sample. We were able to compare who participated to the people who declined participation and compare everybody who did the phone survey to the census in general. And we have no reason to doubt the generalizability of the sample. Both people in the couple had to come into the lab for 6 hours. They did a whole pile of stuff. We really wanted truthful reports about aggression. And yet we were bringing them in and doing this in-person assessment. And usually those things don't work well together. So we had to come up with some pretty complex anonymity procedures to be able to get all of that to work in concert. So folks came in and both in a written consent form and verbally explained to them was that everything that they did as part of the research study was going to not be examined by anyone in the lab until after they had left, and then we only did it in batches, so there was no way to link it up. And that nothing was recorded that would ever allow us to link their responses to their identity. And so therefore, everything they wrote was completely anonymous. But that anything they told us outside of the confines of checking boxes and doing their procedures was subject to the normal limits of confidentiality. And you detail then what all of those are. And so that way, if someone's coming in part because they do have some concerns, because they did want to have a discussion or maybe start a referral to CPS, they know how to do that now. You've given them a roadmap. Don't write me a note on the questionnaire because I'll never be able to connect it to you. But tell me that you're concerned after you fill out this questionnaire, and we can have a conversation, and that will be handled the same way it would if it were clinical contact.
How were these couples solicited? What was the kind of
In the random digit dialing phone survey, we just said that we were looking for families to participate in a study of how families cope with conflict. And we assessed, in the phone survey, we assessed mild partner aggression and corporal punishment, and they look about the same as the folks who didn't come in. And couples were paid $450 because we kept them in the lab for a really long time. So these are the rates of aggression we got. So on this column over here is any physical aggression, so that includes corporal punishment for the parent to child, and it includes things like pushing and slapping for the partner. Over here is severe. So this is more kicking, punching, throwing a child down, choking. These rates are substantially higher than what has been found in most of the surveys. So this column here, overall prevalence, tells us what the self-reported prevalence, or in the point of partner and child, or the partner, it's either partner reporting their prevalence. And then the relative risk ratios are telling you if, so this first one, if there is husband-to-wife aggression, the risk for there being wife-to-husband aggression is 9.9 times higher. So all of the relative risk ratios are up. There's elevated risk everywhere, especially for severe. Even though the prevalences are lower, the risk that brings to the family is higher. And then if you look down here at the prevalences collapsing across gender, so you just have partner and parent, we got nearly a 50% prevalence of some, at least one act of partner physical aggression in the last year. And 87.2% reporting at least one act of physical aggression against their 3 to 7-year-old child. So that's mostly driven by corporal punishment. Then severe, we have a 24% rate of severe partner and a 13% rate of severe parent to child.
Do you have a breakdown of gender of the child victim?
They're about equivalent,
Yeah.
but I don't have that here. So I'm going to just pause for a second and let you look at it so you can find the lines you're most interested in. But these rates, obviously, we're doing a study of aggression. We need there to be some aggression in the sample. We weren't expecting this much.
Is there any evidence of higher aggression toward children with a larger number of children in the family?
We didn't look at that. In general, in the literature, there is, well, actually, we have that in one place that I can show you later on. In general, there's some suggestion in the literature that family size is a risk factor, especially for mothers.
So can you define any and also severe, and are you talking about, like, to me, as much as I don't agree with any physical
Right.
violence, one act in a year is not the same thing
No.
as one act a day. So can you
Absolutely. This is one, that's one act this is at least one act in a year. So one act wasn't the average, but that's what got you counted over here, was at least one act of physical aggression. And like I said, it includes the minor aggressions such as slapping. With children, it includes spanking, pinching. So it includes all of that stuff. So it's not that these rates, I'm not trying to say that all of these people are tremendously victimized and they're afraid and cowering. But these rates are still much higher than the rates we've seen in other studies looking at rates of things. These rates, the severe, are things that are more severe. Like I said, punching, kicking, throwing a child on the floor, beating up, using a knife or gun, choking, scalding. At least once in the past year, but those are much more severe behaviors.
Are you going to show us that breakdown by type of behavior or not?
By individual acts, no. Just by classes. The prevalences of any one act are much lower, but there's no reason to believe that somebody who they don't, just because you kick doesn't mean you're necessarily going to punch with a fist too. And so that's part of why you need to ask the whole array of behaviors on a scale, because there's not just one that can stand in for the others. Okay, so patterns of, oh, yeah.
I'm just unclear, were these observed behaviors in the lab or were
No.
these self-reported?
This is reported behavior in the past year. Okay. All right, patterns of co-occurrence. So so this is reports in the lab in the past year. That's the same standard that has typically been used in those national surveys that I talked about in the beginning, that Dr. Strauss has been so important to. That is the kind of comparable yardstick. It's behavior in the past year. We do have reports from both the father and the mother, or the husband and the wife. So the partner violence reports are based on the reports of both partners, and the rates to child are based on the reports of both parents. Okay, so patterns of co-occurrence. Some things that I found noteworthy. This column now is any, and this column is severe. So this means that over 30% of the families have at least some type of severe physical aggression going on, and only 10% of our families had no physical aggression going on. On the any side, this was a way that I thought interesting. It's most common for both parents to be using corporal punishment against the child, not for one parent to be. You'll see some discussion in the literature. If you have one abusive parent but the other parent's nurturing, that can be a buffering factor, and then everything will be fine. But it's quite typical for both parents to be aggressive.
So on a practical level, is that how it breaks out, that any physical aggression category is corporal punishment?
It's driven by corporal punishment, because most of this, some of the corporal punishment is more severe corporal punishment. It's not all stuff that's taps. And I have to say, we did 2 different versions for some data that I'll show you in a minute. We administered the CTS in the standard way, which has columns that you indicate whether that behavior has happened once in the past year, twice in the past year, 3 to 5 times, 6 to, it has these things up to more than 25 times. And we then also were interested in how things related to each other, and so we asked people then to go through those behaviors again and provide a number estimate for how many times in the past year it had happened. And so some of the corporal punishment incidents were being reported, even though they're a more minor act of corporal punishment, like a spank or a slap, but were being reported at 500 times a year. Really high frequencies.
Were the parents' questionnaires compared to see if they were both acting, if they were saying the same thing?
We did do that with the partner violence reports, because then, of course, they are reporting on the same incidents. They were both there, right? And as is typically the case, there's more agreement about minor aggression than there is with severe aggression. It's just a matter of exactly what people remember. And what's typically done in the field is that if either person says that something happened, you assume it happened, because there's more reason to say it didn't than there is to make it up if it hadn't. The parent-child aggression, we asked the mother to report on her and the father to report on him. There's been a little bit of research that suggests that if you ask parents to report on both, they don't add it up right, and their rates come out lower than if you ask them to report just on themselves. Obviously, if they're adding people together, it can't come out lower than if you had just asked them about themselves. So because of that, we only ask them about their own behavior. Okay, and then I also thought it was interesting that 22% of the sample, 22.5% of the sample, has all 4 kinds of physical aggression going on. Now, that might not be every week. It's not, most of that's not severe aggression, but that's awful lot of kind of generalized aggression in the family. So that isn't something that we had set out to study in this, but as a function of these results, we're a little bit more interested now in saying, well, if you're in a family, if you're a child in a family where everybody hits, what does that do to you and your trajectory versus being in a family where at least somebody doesn't hit somebody, at least sometimes? Then also, it was interesting to note that, that some of the patterns that were suggested in the literature, like there's going to be husband-to-wife aggression and mother-to-child aggression, which is, if I can find that line, right here, that almost doesn't happen. So that's obviously not, you know, the prototypic pattern, at least among these families. Okay, so from this, we were concluding that that both any aggression between partners and severe aggression were more common than we'd expected them to be in a community sample. I think that probably means they're more common than we expect them to be anywhere. It's that if you provide enough anonymity assurances, make people feel safe enough about telling you, and ask everybody who can be a reporter, that you end up finding out more. It just kind of makes sense. And that, that some sort of co-occurrence is the rule, not the exception. If you look on this list, the places where there are individual checks, there's just one kind going on, those aren't, you know, they're reasonably high numbers for severe, but that's because there's still lower level aggression going on in the other dyads. With any mother-only child, you know, mother-only corporal punishment is the only one that's kind of a high number, and it's still nowhere near as high as both parents or all four types of aggression. Okay, so then we wanted to know how interrelated were these types of aggression. If I know that, if I know how aggressive you are.
The last slide, did you talk about the last point?
I had mentioned it while I was here. So some of the patterns of co-occurrence that are most often discussed in the literature weren't really found, like that husband to wife leads to mother to child. Let's see. Well, there had also been husband to wife and wife. Where is it? Husband to wife and this one. That the couple hits each other, but only the mother hits the child. That's not really there. It really does seem to be, most of the things that were in the literature were more husband to wife, and then a husband to wife and father to child, so that he's kind of terroristic, and that is also not really in the sample. Now, it's a community sample. I'm not saying that that would be what you'd find if you went to a shelter, but
Perhaps the terroristic parents chose not.
absolutely. Yep.
Is there any reason in particular that you chose those age groups for the children?
3 to 7, because that is in the zone of when, two things. It's in the zone of when aggression and child abuse seem to be, physical child abuse seem to be at the highest rates, and also because those are ages where we could get kind of comparable measures of child functioning and things across that window. So you can use the same instruments to assess 3-year-olds' behavioral functioning as a 7-year-old's, whereas if we had gone down lower than that, 2-year-olds end up not, their behavior hasn't developed in the same way, so aggression in a 2-year-old doesn't mean the same thing.
I don't think you can clarify for me, but I'm still personally very confused. It seems to me that we're mixing up the rates of individuals who ever use aggression when they shouldn't, and how aggressive people are. So if once in a year,
Okay, once in a year is the threshold, but that doesn't mean that these people were that once. So the whole range is represented here between people who are, so this particular portion of this, I was just talking about occurrence, right? It's a prevalence piece. So that means you're either a yes or a no for a prevalence. That's the way prevalences and incidences work. And the most sensible place for us to draw the line was aggressive, non-aggressive for the prevalence of that, or severe or not severe. So that is at least once in the last year. That's just how the field has been doing it.
But would there not be good reason for the field to change and not use this once and use something like, I don't know, 10 times?
Well, but then what's the difference between 9 versus 10?
Well, yeah, except that when you got one, I mean, my goodness, you can have a parent, for example, you know, who's in a very challenging situation.
Sure, absolutely. Any threshold that you draw is going to have error on both sides of it. You'll have some people who kind of accidentally ended up being, you know, extreme circumstances in the past year had driven them to do something incredibly uncharacteristic, and they're a yes, when otherwise, if you had assessed them at any other point in their lives, they would have been a no. And then there are going to be some people whose life circumstances made things be a little bit easier this year, and because you asked them right now, they're a no instead of a yes. So the same thing would be true if you picked 10. You'd have some people who came in at 9 who'd usually be at 11, and some people who came in at 11 who'd usually be at 9. Any place where you would draw a line to do a dichotomy like that would have some degree of error on either side. So there, as we go through the presentation, there are places where I talk more about extent of aggression, which I think sounds like the construct you're more interested in, the full kind of continuum and distribution so that it includes frequency as well as severity. But the field has had an interest in trying to understand what separates people who are severely aggressive from people who aren't. And for the most part, although I agree with you that if it is just kind of one act, you'd like to be able to find out if that one act is an isolated incident, there's also a fair amount of information that suggests that it's almost never one act. And so because of that, the field has not moved away from the one act being kind of its prevalence. So this is now moving on to extent of aggression, and what if we know how aggressive you are in one of these dyads, what does that tell us? What can that predict about how aggressive you might be in another dyad? So this is done with regression. This is, you know, one of these ugly statistical result tables. So in predicting husband-to-wife aggression, the most important other variable, the only other one that tells you how aggressive this husband is going to be, is how aggressive the wife is to him. And then wife-to-husband aggression is predicted both by how aggressive her husband is to her and also how aggressive she is to her child. Those parallel each other when you're trying to predict parent-to-child aggression. And this is interesting because I don't think people have had the data to really look at this. Father-to-child aggression, how aggressive you are. So this is extent. It's not yes-no. It's frequency and severity. How aggressive you are as a father is predicted by how aggressive your wife is to your child. Not anywhere near as much as how your behavior to each other predicts your aggression, but still significantly. And then how aggressive the mother is to the child is predicted both by how aggressive the father is to the child and how aggressive she is to her husband. So it looks like for women, there's a dyadic and an individual effect, whereas for men, it's primarily a dyadic effect. That wasn't really the entire point of the study, so we didn't do a lot to follow up on that yet, but it's interesting.
I mean, I assume these were all heterosexual couples?
These are all heterosexual couples. Again, just because of it was another one of those constraints that you need to put on in research.
Is the regression for just any assaults or severe assaults?
This includes any assault, but it includes frequency and severity. So you get higher scores here if you do more behaviors and if you do more severe behaviors. Lower scores if you do fewer, less severe behaviors. Obviously, lowest score if you do nothing aggressive. Okay, so I already said that. We were also interested in the participants themselves' own perceptions of how causally connected these acts of aggression were to each other. So they using this complicated way of refilling out the CTFs, we're asked to estimate the proportion of all instances of each act of aggression. So every time you spanked your child, every time you slapped your husband, whatever it might be, what proportion of the time was it that your partner had just been verbally aggressive to you? What proportion of the time had your child just been verbally aggressive to you? So your kid mouthed off and you slapped them or whatever. What proportion of the time had your partner been physically aggressive to you, your child been physically aggressive to you, something else your partner had just done, your child had just done, and something else not related to your partner or your child? I boiled this down quite a bit, but there is a paper on it. So, men's physical partner aggression was most likely to be in response to their partner's physical aggression. So he was saying she slapped or pushed or whatever, and I whacked her back. Women's physical partner aggression was most often in reaction to their partner's verbal aggression. So he said something that I just couldn't tolerate. Matches the way they portray it on television, too. So I already said that. So risk factors. Okay. I'm going really much too slow. If you can think way back to the beginning of the talk, and I talked about risk factors and said there were all these different types of risk factors that showed up in both literatures and a couple variables that had shown up in just one or two, and we were interested in how those all fit together to predict aggression, how parallel those predictive models were for men and for women, how parallel they were for parent-child aggression and for partner aggression. To what extent does it look like there are common processes going on here versus things that are truly unique and specific? So did all sorts of things that are good if you're developing statistical models. And now, you're not expected to read it, but this gives you a sense of all the stuff that's in here. This is men's partner aggression. Women's partner aggression. And so, the boiled down part. The proximal factors for men were dominance and jealousy, marital adjustment, partner blaming attributions, their anger expression style, violence in their family of origin, and perceived social support. Each of those things accounted for some unique variance. That means that they had a direct path to aggression with no other intermediate variables, whereas all these other things out here had to work their way through other variables. Women's predictors: dominance and jealousy, marital adjustment, blaming attributions, childhood history of aggression instead of whether there was violence in the family of origin. Anger expression style was more distal, and perceived social support was more distal. And both of the models accounted for more than 50% of the variance with this sort of thing. That's a lot. So a lot of similarity there. Father's aggression to kids. Mother's aggression to kids. Proximal predictors, blaming attributions. There it is again, for both fathers and mothers. Anger expression, this time for both fathers and mothers. Discipline style for both fathers and mothers, attitudes approving of parental aggression for fathers and mothers, and then family size, and again, childhood history of aggression for moms. These models accounted for less of the variance, but still a substantial proportion.
So that would be the mom's history of being aggressive?
Right, that she got into physical fights when she was in school, that sort of thing. And so a lot of parallel between men's and women's models. A little bit of uniqueness, but the uniqueness is pretty subtle. And there's a little bit of uniqueness between partner aggression and parent-child aggression, but a lot of overlap. So the discipline stuff and dominance and jealousy show up differently. Relationship satisfaction is proximal in the partner violence models. It's more distal in the parent-to-child models. And some of the things that were interesting to us as we were doing this, we had a lot more variables that we tested that ended up not adding uniquely to those models. Some of those things are things that we think of as being really important clinically, like alcohol and drugs. Didn't stay in a single model. And it could be, it's really interesting to us. It could be that that's because it doesn't account for a unique variance after including all those other variables, or it could be that it's more of a moderator, that you're walking around with these risk factors, and if you're drunk, it puts you at much higher risk, and if you're not, you're at a little bit less high risk. But it's not that the alcohol itself is the risk factor as much as it provides a different context in which the other risk factors operate. So we're interested in following up on that. Childhood aggression stayed for women, whereas violence in the family of origin had stayed for men. So those are more parallel. Perceived social support for men is a direct predictor, and it's an indirect predictor for women. Let's see. It's here for men, and it's here for women. So it's in the women's model, but it's not accounting for unique variance. It's a general perceived social sort, so it's my sense that there are people around me in my life who I can turn to if I need something, instrumental things like a cup of sugar, or to talk, or to go out on a Saturday night. It's a range of no, just social support. Well, it's more proximal for men.
Why would that logically be connected in any way?
In any way. Well,
I would think it'd be the opposite. You would think it'd be the opposite. Men who don't have,
Actually, the way I would explain that is that I think men put so much of their emotional eggs in the basket with their wife. So when there's problems, they're so isolated they have no supports. So I think that makes a lot of sense from my work.
okay.
Right.
That's what I'm saying. Should be lack of social support.
Right, and here it's a positive path. The thing that you can't get from these models, though, is that this is more statistics than you want to know right now, but every one of these relations is tested holding every other relation in the model constant. So because of that, you can't get from this what the zero order effect would be. So if you just correlated social support with aggression, it is negative. But in the context of this model, when you're controlling for everything else that's already in here, there's a unique small positive effect, and we don't know.
But it is social support, not lack of social support.
Right. In the model, that's the way it functions. When you look at the zero order correlations, it's a lack.
Well, Amy,
Yeah.
people who have social support maybe are more conservative or more traditional, and therefore they have traditional beliefs about corporal punishment and violence, maybe?
It could be. It also, it could be that if you are, because again, it's kind of in the context of where you are and all these other risk factors. So whoever had asked about whether it's their support for violence, it could be that there's a group of people who end up kind of hanging out with other like-minded guys, and it's that like-mindedness that you end up seeing there, that I have like-minded friends, either pro-violence, which pushes me up, or anti-violence, which pushes me down, but causes a negative correlation. I mean, positive correlation. Where do you expect a negative one? Trying to think about if I want to do anything else. We've just started doing some looking at trying to distinguish people who are just partner violent and not aggressive to their children more severely aggressive to your children, because almost everybody does at least some corporal punishment. And trying to see what we can do to predict whether you're not the other, both for partner violence and for parent-child. We've just started that, so we don't have it. It's not written up yet. We're kind of still in the midst of the analyses. But these look like the variables that are predicting men who are only aggressive to their child versus both. I'll just let you look at them for a second because it's so preliminary. Partner only versus both. And it's things that make sense, you know, child behavior problems, how aggressive your wife is to the child. Women, there's again a lot of parallel between the men's and the women's. The models generally are accounting for about 80% correct classification, which is okay, but not great. And the influence of the other partner seems to be more important to partner aggression than parent-child. I could say some things about prevention, except I think we're probably only have about 7 or 8 minutes left for questions. So, thank the people who worked on the project with me. There are many more than that, but those are the primary people, and of course the grant. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, well, good then. I'll go slower. Thanks. Somehow I was thinking 5:15 and I was so late. Like, how did I get so late? Oh, well, let's go back to the pictures then. Let's talk more about that. Okay. So anyway, distinguishing. So we didn't include spanking with your hand on their bottom and pinching and grabbing, but we did include, you know, spanking with a hard object. It's still included in here. So men, age, childhood history of aggression, relationship adjustment, attributions, power and balance in a relationship, dominance and jealousy, unrealistic expectations, anger expression, depressive symptoms, impulsivity. So kind of some of this is their general, kind of their overall level of functioning, that people who are having a harder time functioning are more likely to be both partner and aggressive, partner violent and parentally violent, whatever.
So these are the characteristics
that distinguish.
That characterize them both.
Right, these are the ones that tell us both. Okay. And then reactivity and partner's aggressiveness. So there are a lot of kind of couple things which make complete sense that they would help tell you whether somebody is both parent aggressive and partner aggressive added in. We measured heart rate, skin conductance, systolic and diastolic blood pressure in reaction to watching standardized vignettes of escalating couple conflicts.
Could you just operationalize flooding?
Flooding is a construct that John Gottman had introduced to the literature that is a sense of being kind of overwhelmed and incapacitated by the other person's negative affect coming at you. And so it's a self-report measure of that.
You included spanking and pinching to your coat. What would be the percent?
What would be the percent? Well, we would have, in this analysis, we would have a lot more parent-onlys than both, whereas now they're about equal. In this analysis, the partner-only but both, we'd have almost no one in both. Because everybody is, if you include more minor corporal punishment, remember that was a 88% prevalence, and so we'd have very few people who we could look at as being not aggressive to their kids.
One of the earlier questions you had stated that you didn't measure the number of kids in the home, yet one of the bullets there indicates family size.
Yes. Well, what I had said is that we didn't look at that particularly directly in this study. We did assess how many kids there were, and that was entered as a risk factor both in here and in these models back here. But we're not finding anything that doesn't say what the literature generally says, which is that family size is a predictor of risk, especially for mother-to-child aggression.
Your physiological measures, did you find any support for the whole vagal reactor concept?
In the sense that we found negative, which I think is what people who are doing this are finding more and more, negative associations, so that people who are more aggressive are better at vagal suppression, they're less reactive. We found no evidence of the Cobra pit bull, two types, these kind and those kinds. There's, It's a really nice idea, but it's failed to replicate 90 times now.
It sounds good.
It does. It's very sexy. That's why it got on Oprah.
Half the people that the men in my program have had really heavy head traumas. And those are the ones that are, going
Yes.
from 0 to 60 really right away.
Yes.
And with the vets coming back and all the head trauma and all that kind of thing, it would be interesting to know
Yeah.
just how many of these people have been in combat or have had
Right. I mean, I think in this sample, we probably didn't have very many. There has been research. Alan Rosenbaum's done some research looking at the relation between head trauma and risk for severe partner violence, and there is a significant one. And I know I do a fair amount of research with the military, and I know they're very concerned.
And the Army Clinic is doing brain mapping too, and
Yeah.
it sort of came out inadvertently in my work, and just as I began to explore that.
Yeah. We don't have anything that speaks to that in here at all, but it is with everybody coming back from Iraq, it's an ever more important issue.
In answer to that earlier question about the frequency of the violent acts and severity and so forth, do you have any data for that?
I don't think I put it in here. Our average number of severe, let me see if I can remember it. The average number of acts for both severe and any, I believe in all cases was at least 10 a year, which that's part of why, I'm sure there are some people who are in the sample who are counted as yeses who had the one isolated incident, but that isn't what's typical. But I don't remember the exact numbers.
You do have the numbers.
Oh, sure, and they're in the paper that is on the disc. I don't know exactly how the disc is working, but the papers that go with the presentations that are on the disc, it's in there, so you can look it up.
I'm just wondering if you've considered this or under sort of the model of borderline personality organization attachment issues. I mean, is that
Well, I think the way that borderline attachment issues have generally been talked about in the partner violence literature, I think at this point makes sense as being particularly relevant to a group of individuals, but probably not universally relevant to the same degree across all people. So in this sample, because we have 450 community couples, we weren't expecting to see enough folks who would be in, Amy Holsworth Monroe's borderline disorganized dysphoric group to have that show up, because we were expecting a maybe 16, maybe 20%, because they're a little bit young, rate of partner violence. And then the borderline subgroup is not the most prevalent subgroup of partner violence. So then if we had gotten our 20% rate, that would be 80 partner violent folks, and then maybe 20 of them would have been in Amy Holsworth Monroe's kind of borderline dysphoric group. So that to find those 20, since we were looking more kind of across the whole sample, it didn't seem like something that it would have been worth pursuing. Given how high our rates of prevalences are, we might have been able to find it. We don't have anything in here that specifically speaks to their relationship attachment style, fear of abandonment, those sorts of things. We don't have it.
Different question. Do you have any thoughts or comments on the field in general? That one of the things that always frustrates me is there's this split between child abuse and domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
And do you have any comments? Because this co-occurrence is extremely important stuff.
Right.
It's so seldom ever addressed, not just with researchers, but clinicians, and in general, in this whole field. Do you have any thoughts about why that is?
Well, the why is easier than the what to do about it. So thank you for giving me the why to respond to. On the research side, as few people as possible study child abuse. It's a messy thing to study. You either need to be, and the people who do study child abuse tend to study CPS-involved families, because that's the easiest way to get that information. And then they try not to do any other assessment of abuse, because it triggers mandated reporting if they discover anything that wasn't part of the original allegations and all of that, and it just gets sticky. There are some people who do youth victimization surveys and things, and that's great, but it's just not, it's a hard area to research. There are a lot of ethical issues that are involved and a lot of dilemmas that people face when they're trying to do that. So there are people I know who are interested in the phenomena of parent-child aggression, and even people who are interested in co-occurrence of partner violence and child abuse, but who just don't want to quite go all the way there. And so they'll ask about the frequency of spanking and don't want to ask about any other parental acts, because they're concerned that it'll raise too many ethical concerns, they won't be able to finish their study, parents will feel too uncomfortable to answer, etc. So I know somebody who only asked about spanking. I know somebody else who will do the whole corporal punishment scale of the CTS, but nothing more severe than that, which then just gives you a very different picture if you can't speak to the more severe side of things. I think on the partner violence side, there are the people who are coming at all of this from the perspective of wanting to understand and protect female victims. The last thing they wanted to do was to start assessing whether she's doing anything not so good with the kids. That's counter the point. So since they had plenty of things to study on the just her experience and what's going on with her, it wasn't high on their priority list to try to get to that. Most of the research on co-occurrence that was in that 1998 meta-analysis was done by doing things like going into the shelter and asking her to report on, in some of the studies, it was his violence towards her and his violence to the child. And that's it. And because that's what they were in a position to be willing to do something about. There's a piece of it that I do understand, although it's not really answering your question, but the research question. But the person, as a researcher, if I'm asking her, she's in the shelter, she's already, obviously, whatever else you want to say, life is not going well. And if you now have her tell you about all the things she's done to the kids, you're going to have to file a CPS report, and there's no way that's going to make her life happier in the short run. So I can understand why the shelter might not be willing to let you do it. You might not be willing to go that far. So partner violence research wasn't dying to get into all of that. And then on the systems side, I think it's the same thing. You know, you've got people whose mission is set up to help victims. They don't want to find out that the victim is doing something bad. They want to support the victim. You've got people who are there to treat perpetrators. Well, they don't want to find out there are other things going on too. They know how to do their thing. This is this system. It's not a that system. I don't want to, you know, go finding out about that. And then on the child abuse side, again, you have people who are about the kids. And it's, you know, you've always heard for a long time about stories where she'll get a failure to protect child maltreatment charge against her for letting her abusive boyfriend into the apartment, things like that. And the fact that the systems didn't seem to be working together gets a reasonable amount of attention. There has been more movement since in the 1990s and now toward trying to have more coordinated systems. It's still really difficult because I think no matter what you do, you know, you have people who have different priorities, and trying to get everyone to be on the same page, especially when we know that none of the systems work perfectly anyway. So if you want to find fault with one of the system's responses, you often can find fault somewhere.
So Amy, when I was doing research a few years ago, just to go along with I do batterer intervention trainings, and so I was trying to find, you know, studies on co-occurrence, and as you said, you know, all the literature seemed to be focused on battered women in shelters. So, and what happens, I accidentally, I guess what I did is I got fed up with the domestic violence literature because I couldn't find anything, so I just started looking at child abuse literature, and I accidentally found a study by Diana English and her colleagues, and I find Diana English with this sample of women who had lost custody of their kids, and then she asked them about violence with intimate partners and whether they had been violent towards their partners or the other way around. You know, can you talk about that? Because that's a really fascinating study.
Well, I mean, Diana English does fabulous research in general, so all of her work is really good. But yeah, so therefore, because they had already lost custody of the kids, the child abuse is a given, and so you don't have to. You're not having to do any assessment there, and then you'll be able to help refresh my memory. But the rates of bidirectional partner violence were quite high. It was not a clear picture of, well, Dad hit me and I hit the kids, like, you know, some of the clinical literature, I'll say. So.
Well, the other thing I was going to say about that study is that it also showed that what had the most impact on the children was mom's verbal and emotional abuse of the children.
Yeah.
There was mom's verbal abuse of the children had more of an impact than mom's physical abuse of the children, or mom's violence towards dad, or dad's violence towards mom.
Right. And the literature on the effects of family violence on kids is definitely kind of, to say that it's in its infancy, even though it's been going on for a while, it hasn't gotten very far yet. It tends to do a lot of, we found a bunch of kids who were attached to a shelter or who have active child abuse cases open on them. We assess their function and we divide them into groups and say, okay, look at that. So most of the studies on the effects of partner violence on kids never ask about the parents' behavior to the children directly, which I've always thought was an interesting oversight. And then there are lots of studies now saying there's tremendous heterogeneity in children's response, that there are some children that look horrible, some children that look very internalizing and fearful, some children that are very acting out, and some children that look great, no problems. And trying to, try to develop complicated models that will account for that without ever assessing any of the other things that are going on in the family. And I think it makes a lot more sense to assess some of those things going on in the family. So we're actually doing a study of that now. We're about halfway through data collection.
I was going to just say one study that was done by Peter Neidig and George Thorne, and actually I was like the author on that paper, very simply looked at whether the kid, and we were looking at kids that were in the Job Corps, subjectively felt that they were abused. So we objectively measured what they'd experienced from their parents, and then we actually asked at a separate point in the assessment, when you look back at your childhood, did you think you were abused? And we actually got four groups. I mean, so there's people in every box. There are people that had the bad experiences and they think they're abused. There are people who had bad experiences but subjectively do not consider
we're
themselves to
fine.
have been abused. There are people that didn't objectively report any of these negative physical findings, but then when they look back at their childhood, they say, yes, I was abused. And,
Right.
people that had none of these experiences. And it turns out that there were different sequelae for each of those things. So one of the things that I think is really important is that there must be a cognitive component to how you're experiencing this trauma and how you're understanding it that carries you forward in some different ways.
I think that's true, and the data does suggest that there's John Gritch's stuff on cognitive appraisal and all of that matters. I do think, though, that, and I wonder if that is an interesting window onto the fact that we can't just ask about any one class of bad parenting or bad partnering, that you need to assess kind of the wider variety of all of that.
Could you talk a little bit more about the different treatment approaches or the interventions? You mentioned implications.
Sure. This is not, now I'm just going to tell you kind of some of the things we're thinking, because obviously it hasn't been, people haven't developed this stuff and tested it yet. But it seems like if you look at the models and you look at the co-occurrence literature and you look at the things that distinguish people who are only one violent and only one dyad versus both, that if you've got someone who you do a thorough family assessment and you find out that you have a dad who is aggressive towards his partner, towards his kids, in a family where the mom is aggressive towards the dad and towards the kids, and they are high on they're high on the kind of bad personal functioning risk factors like stress and depression and all of that, anger expression and blaming attributions and relationship problems. That probably treating him in isolation for one of those things is the weakest way you could attack that problem. Probably the stronger way for you to attack the problem would be to engage both the mother and the father, whether it's separately or together would depend on all sorts of other things, but in both of them in treatment simultaneously, a kind of trying to get at that whole array of personal functioning and reactivity and blaming and anger and those risk factors, not focusing as much on power and jealousy and things like that, because that's not what put them at risk for this whole pattern of violence. Whereas if you had a dad where you assessed and found out that he's aggressive to his partner, that's the aggression in the family. Then based on all of this, you'd probably also find out that there are some jealousy issues and that there is differential power. Same thing would be true if you were looking at it, if the woman was the one person who was aggressive to her partner and not anywhere else. And that would just suggest a different treatment strategy, that treatment focusing just on him would make sense, that treatment would focus probably somewhat more on some of the variables that are at least slightly more kind of traditionally incorporated in better intervention programs, and that would be a sensible way to tackle things. And then I think it just kind of goes from there. It's the same sort of thing if you're starting from the child abuse side and you have this mom who's now kind of in the system for child abuse, and so she's supposed to go to a parenting class. And if you look, and she is aggressive to her kids, but it's in this larger context with all of this other stuff going on, then probably giving her parent training is not the most efficient way to try to unpack what's going on in that family. So, but that's the level at which the implications are spun out at this point.
What we're running into in one of our parenting groups is that we have a huge cultural component, many different cultures, and none of them agreeing on what child abuse is and wanting to, go back to their primary culture and state that, we just don't understand why
Right.
we're sent here. This doesn't even, this isn't child abuse. So the definition itself
Yes.
is difficult.
I mean, I do think that's one of the, all of our work would be made much easier if we could have kind of consistent, well-operationalized, clinically useful definitions, because you can then communicate those to people and say, well, I understand what you're saying about where you're from or what happened in your family or whatever, but you can look here, see, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Here in Sacramento, we're not allowed to do da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and so that's why you're here. And that's a lot easier to discuss with people than when it's some kind of really amorphous, well, my neighbor down the road does it too, and she's not here, and we did it for 7 years before anybody ever, this was just this random occurrence that somebody kind of caught on. It's that was weird. It's not our behavior's fine, and it's just a lot harder with our definitions being the way they are.
The men in my group often go, yeah, that's a problem today, is we're not allowed to hit our kids, or we did before. My dad used to, hit me and everything. I said, look at him, I go, yeah, you guys are all
Right, see the ones that get to say, oh, we turned out fine, Murray's college professor stories. The NIH reviewers are in a better position to say that. Right.
this is not where, do you think that this is the best place to be?
Yeah. It's definitely true that corporal punishment and the parenting side of this especially, people totally feel like their personal experiences are the level of expertise someone needs. And that the rest of it is, like I said, I do a fair amount of work with the military, and there have been times where we've gone out and done briefings of things. And I remember this one general saying, well, we wouldn't have any problems with family violence at all if me and the chaplain, we could just, I'm like, okay, fine. You can have your worldview, but that's not how it works.
I'd like to hear a little bit about the community-based approach.
Sure.
That's why you're having
No, because we're all having an interesting conversation. But so we've taken this to move in two directions in our intervention work, and we've been mostly focused on prevention rather than treatment per se. The first is trying to use a community-based approach, and this approach was designed kind of from the data that suggests that these things co-occur and that there are important overlapping risk factors. So what we're doing is going into communities, and they conduct a survey looking at the self-reported anonymous prevalence of, and this time it's something closer to maltreatment. It's aggression plus impact and fear and all of that. And then also people report on a host of kind of the associated risk and protective factors. And then there's, in the communities we're in, there's kind of a group of folks who all represent kind of the primary helping agencies who have come together and have decided that they need to try to kind of help work together for their community. And that they then look at those data and use the data to help them think about which risk and protective factors are in most need of targeting in their community. So if you have a community that looks like it's very high on stress, for example, and their data suggests that in that community stress is strongly associated with rates of partner emotional abuse and child physical abuse and neglect maybe, then they could look at that and say, okay, well, we need to be putting some things in place that would help ameliorate stress. because most communities, we're doing this is one of the things we're doing in the military. These communities are pretty saturated with you don't hit, you don't do, that all of the kind of direct targeting of family violence is out there. And so doing more of that is probably not going to get you any more bang for your buck. They need to have something different to supplement that with. So they put together, they then look at, there's a guidebook that gives them summaries of all of the empirically supported strategies that have been published in the literature to deal with each of the risk and protective factors, and they put together a program of activities that they think will alter their community's risk and protective profile based on their community's data. And then they go about doing that. So we're in the midst of a randomized trial in that. Our post-data collection will be coming up this spring, starting in April. So sometime next fall, we'll get to find out if that worked. And then the primary prevention approach that we're doing is kind of thinking more about, back from kind of one of the earlier slides, the importance of the family level influences and partners' influence on each other, both in terms of their couple functioning, their partner violence, and also their parent-to-child aggression. And so we're going in with parents with new babies who are at they have to be at slightly elevated risk for partner violence to be in the trial. And then doing kind of, a normal, I think, skills training kind of component, some work on sensitive and responsive parenting and attachment, and kind of supporting each other in co-parenting through newborns, communication training, conflict resolution, how to avoid violence and escalated conflicts, and those kind of skill-building approaches, trying to do that before things are kind of more out of hand, with the idea being that if you can target both people in the couple and help them become each other's kind of cycle in a more positive way, that should lower the risk for aggression anywhere in the family. And that's a study that we're just starting, that CDC funded this past fall. So, and that actually was the last slide.